Okay. Today is June 8th, 2011, and we are in the Multimedia Center of Lehman College with Jacob Judd, Jacob Judd, who has agreed to be interviewed for the Lehman College Oral History Project. And Jacob Judd retired in 1998 as professor of history, and now he serves as president of the Lehman Retirees Association. He started teaching at the School of General Studies on Hunter's Bronx campus in 1963, with a special focus on the history of New York. So Jack, what interested you in this area, in teaching history, and what motivated you to become an historian?
Well, that has to go back to my early time, really, as an undergraduate. I went to NYU University Heights College, which is now Bronx Community College. And one of the professors there, a man by the name of Baird Still, S-T-I-L-L, B-A-Y-R-D, taught a number of the basic history courses, and he also taught a course in New York history. I was really fascinated with it. I was not a history major.
You were a German major.
I was a German major, preparing actually in pre-med. So I have quite a bit of science courses as well in my background. Then when I graduated and was about to graduate and applied to medical school, which is where I really thought I was going, I was put on a waiting list. And I had to wait a year. What was I going to do during that year? So I decided to pick up some history courses on the graduate level at NYU and then see what happens. Well, I became fascinated really with the fundamentals of studying history and decided I'm going to switch my attitude and move in the direction of history. And that's what I did. I pursued history and then first received a master's in history and then eventually, of course, the doctorate.
And you grew up in Brooklyn and you ended up writing your dissertation about Brooklyn.
It was, well, as I said, since Baird Still then continued in the graduate school, he said, what would you particularly care to write about? Now, at that time, urban history was really in its, I'd say, early stages. There were very few major studies. Baird Still's study at that time was on Milwaukee. He eventually was going to write Mirror for Gotham, which is still used in a lot of history courses. And Baird said, why don't you think in terms of something locally, because there's a lot of material that should be floating around. Well, I checked around and found that there were a number of institutions containing quite a bit of material relating to early Brooklyn, and there was a particular period of time in Brooklyn history that was not covered by early historians. And I decided to focus in on that. And I spent years just doing the research because it meant reading every newspaper, every daily newspaper that was published for 25 years. And that took a great deal of time before I could even sit down and begin writing.
So tell me how you first got connected to Hunter College. You taught there part-time, right?
That's a fascinating story in itself. While I was still actually a graduate student, already with my master's degree, and then NYU placed me in the School of Commerce, basically as a department, if you want to call them al factotum, a general helper, assistant. No sooner did I get there than the senior professor teaching government courses, political science courses, became seriously ill. And I was thrown into his program. So from an early day, I was put into the classroom, really even on graduate course level. I stayed there, I think it was about a year and a half, something of that sort. when the department decided they were going to bring in a name individual to take over that slot, because, as I said, that was a senior position. They brought somebody in, and I happened to say the guy stayed 1 year and left. Meanwhile, I had to find something else. So through a friend of mine from the history department, I found out that there was an opening as a historian with an organization dealing with historic buildings. And that was known in those days as Sleepy Hollow Restorations.
Right.
Today, that's Historic Hudson Valley, HHV. Went over there, and I became one of the 2 research historians for Sleepy Hollow Restorations. While there, I also learned quite quickly that Hunter College was looking for adjunct people. So I went and applied, and sure enough, I was immediately accepted.
And your first teaching at Hunter was in the
Downtown,
Midtown campus?
downtown. Didn't even know about the uptown campus. And I taught there downtown. And meanwhile, in my full-time position, number one, I was given the opportunity to actually sit and learn early American history, which I did on their paycheck, which was very nice. Also learned that as part of the program, they were thinking in terms of sending someone over to Europe to go through the archives to find more material relating to early New York. And I knew that I was being pegged for that position. Sure enough, it came through in the middle of a semester. So I went to the chair of the department, who was then Margaret Gambrell, and explained the situation to her. And I told her, I said, I will not drop a course in the middle of a semester. I just won't do that. I said, because I've had experience moving into that period twice at NYU. The first time, I was put into a position where I was supposed to just substitute for one evening. Found out the next day the man had left, had disappeared. And I was thrown into that course. So from experience, I just did not want to do that. And Gambrell sat down and she said, you are going to Europe. She said, you cannot lose that opportunity. That's a great experience. You must take it. I said, what about the course? She said, don't worry about the course. We'll take care of it. However, she said, there's one stipulation. You must keep me constantly in contact as to what you're doing and what's going on in England. I said, it would be my pleasure.
So Mary Gambrell was chair at the time.
She was chair.
And she ended up being dean at Hunter.
That's right.
And then president.
Then president.
Briefly.
Well, the story continues. It went off to Europe, and certainly did keep a regular correspondence with her. And we came back on a Monday in September. And she told me specifically, call me immediately when you return, which I did. And I called her that Monday afternoon, and she informed me my classes begin that night. I told her, I said, I'm a terrible, terrible sailor. It was an awful voyage. Came back, I forget even, I think it was on the Independence. Awful trip. So I said, please postpone the course until Wednesday. I'll make up the work. And so, of course, that started my second phase at Hunter College. Just within about one semester, I knew that there were the rumors going around the department that most likely I was going to be pegged, if I would accept it, for a position up in the Bronx where I had already started. I had taught one course at that time up here. The idea was that up in the Bronx, they were going to start a separate program called the School of General Studies under Chester Robinson. And Chester Robinson, in turn, was sort of supervised, if you want to call it that way, by Glenn Nygreen.
Okay.
The idea was that a number of departments would have a full-time person in this School of General Studies. There were, let's say, English department, psychology, political science, sociology, and myself in history. We were the nucleus. We came in and we were really basically the senior people teaching in the School of General Studies on regular lines. That continued for a number of years until it was determined under Leonard Leaf that the whole thing would be changed and that the School of General Studies would be incorporated into the overall college program and not regarded as a separate entity, as a separate unit of
And
the college.
school, you were saying before the interview that the School of General Studies essentially was a night school. It started in the late afternoon.
Started late afternoon and into
and
the
weekends as
evening.
well?
In those days, we did not have any weekend. Now, however, I had a weekend program
Okay.
at the graduate school, actually undergraduate at Hunter College.
Down in Park Avenue.
Down in Park Avenue.
Okay.
I taught New York history down at Park Avenue.
And that was for
That was on Saturday mornings.
And who took those classes?
Teacher education.
Right. Okay.
That was a mandatory course at that time.
Still is.
Good for them.
Yeah. So when did the SGS become? I think in the mid '70s you were still involved with it.
Yes, that's right. It was in the mid '70s
Right.
that changed. I think it was during that whole process when everything changed in the university.
With the
in
financial crisis.
Exactly, in the mid.
So was it kind of part of downsizing, or?
Well, it wasn't really. It was the idea of spreading the time in which students could take courses. In other words, it opened the opportunity that a student could take a course early in the morning or in the evening. It made no difference
Right.
any longer as to when the course was given.
So in the 60s and early 70s, you could only take either a daytime schedule or an evening schedule?
Pretty much so.
Okay. And was your sense that there was a sort of a, second-class citizen perception?
Well, there was. However, we all regarded, those of us who were teaching the courses,
Yeah.
that the evening program had far better students because they were older, more committed, and had a better background
Sure.
insofar as preparation.
Was it a similar ethnic composition in the 60s? Because I know Hunter in the Bronx was more Catholic than most of the colleges.
Hunter in Park Avenue was more Catholic.
Okay.
I would not say that was the same thing
Up in the Bronx.
here in the Bronx. We had a very large Jewish contingent. And then the Protestant. We also had a very
Right.
large Irish contingent up here in the Bronx.
And
all
apart-
that disappeared.
And apart from being kind of more working students and older, what were they different in other regards from the undergraduates during the day?
Well, many of them were working people, so they already had some career, maybe a part-time career, but they did have a career already under their belts, whereas the daytime students pretty much went full-time as students.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about some of the people you worked for in your early years at Hunter. Another chair you had, I think, when you started full-time was
Dorothy Fowler.
Dorothy Fowler. Tell me
Okay.
about her.
Okay. Gambrell had gone on to become president by that time. Dorothy Fowler, I did not have the best relationship with Dorothy Fowler, mainly because when I was sent up here into the Bronx, I had a full teaching load here in the Bronx, plus this course down at Hunter on Saturdays, with the assumption that that was included in the overall process, that was the overall coursework that I was expected to do.
It was part of your teaching load.
Exactly. Eventually, I happened to sit down either over coffee or someplace with Chet Robinson and asked him, why did he agree for such a program? he didn't even know about it. So at that point, I realized that she had taken advantage of me. And I held that against her for many, many years. Now, when Gambrell died, the funeral was held in one of the major churches on, I think it was on Park Avenue. The place was jammed. And Fowler, of course, attended also. And Fowler made the statement. She said, "When I go, I am not going to have a reception like this." Gambrell was really loved. She was a very, very lovely person.
You started full-time up in the Bronx in 1963.
Right.
Did you have any other options? Did you, at the time, or what led you to stay here for the rest of your career?
Well, in '63, as I said, I came as one of the people for the School of General Studies. Then by 1967, it became apparent that there was going to be a split. There was going to be a separation. And everyone down at Hunter College was given a choice.
Right.
Either you stay here, or you have a choice of going up, or even splitting your program.
Right.
A number of us in the history department, we were known as the Young Turks,
Right.
all decided to go up to the Bronx. Basically, either we lived up in the area, or we found it more convenient, or we felt that there was a challenge to help really create something new. And we went up there, including Erwin Polishuk, Larry Ratner, Wiley Cipher, myself. Corinne Weston came very shortly afterwards, and we became, Johanna Meskel came.
Right.
So it was a very, very nice group.
And it strikes me that shortly after Lehman became Lehman,
Right.
The student population changed pretty quickly.
Well, it happened in the 70s when open enrollment occurred. And that also, the Bronx went through a tremendous change just about the same time.
Right.
And the two occurrences really created that major, major shift in the school population.
Did that change the way you went about teaching history, especially history of New York, to these people?
Well, they knew nothing, really. They had no background whatsoever. But again, teaching some of I purposely would choose to teach a course around 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, knowing I would get an older population.
Right.
And they had some background, which really was quite a joy to teach them. Whereas if I taught the course at 8 o'clock in the morning, these students had no background whatsoever.
From a pretty early point in your career, from the late 60s, early 70s, it seems like you took you discovered you had a talent in administration. You started working on a lot of committees and so forth.
This started actually in the School of General Studies. They had to actually, in a way, when I can refer back to one of your comments, that would think in terms of us as seconds, secondary
second-class citizens.
Second-class students or second-class citizens. We realized that on a number of occasions, when there were major groups being created on the campus, major committees, no one was asked from this group in School of General Studies, and we objected to that. And almost immediately, I don't know why they decided so, they said, you've got to be.
So you were the activist.
I was the activist. I had to be on the committee. So I was on one of the early committees on the future of the college. I remember that very specifically. We had, I don't know how many meetings we had.
Was that when it was Lehman, or that was when it was still Hunter?
That was still Hunter. It was still Hunter. It was the year before we became Lehman, 1967.
So in 1967 was the future of the college it was already known that it was going to be split up?
Yes, that's right.
So you were involved in the discussions about the split.
That's right.
And might that have happened in a different way? I mean, was there a possibility that the way it unfolded would have been different than the way it did unfold?
No, we had really had very little to say about this. This came from on high.
So who on high? Who called those shots?
It was even before. It was even above Leonard Leaf. It was the board at that time.
The Hunter Board of Trustees.
No, I think it was the university.
So the initial CUNY Board of Trustees.
Yes, right.
Okay. And
right.
they decided
the early board. Yeah.
They decided that you're going to take Hunter and.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. When did you get involved in the union?
Almost immediately, not directly with the union, but with the welfare fund. Again, I forget who it was, someone here on the campus who then left, somebody in the psychology department. He said, we really should have a representative on the campus in that very, very important process. I did not know at that time that there was somebody already from the college, and that was Janet Messing from the economics department. And I went down there, and this was prior to the creation of the Professional Staff Congress. I was a member of the legislative conference. But primarily, while a member of the legislative conference, primarily my work was already with the welfare fund. This was the very early stages of the welfare fund.
What was there before a welfare fund?
There was nothing, nothing whatsoever. And it was almost on a individual basis.
You were all on your own.
That's right, pretty much so. But with the welfare fund, we created the various programs that everyone is very familiar with today.
Right. And you were a colleague of and friends with Erwin Polishuk from early on.
Yes.
You co-organized a conference, right?
Pardon me?
You organized
yes. Again, that was through the restorations.
Right.
In those days, the restoration was very involved in historical process and involved in really creating conferences that have a solid historical basis. So from my old contacts, actually, even though I left the restorations in 1963 when I became full-time here at Hunter College, in 1968 I was called back again as a consultant, and I stayed with them as a consultant for the next 20 years. So in that time, we put together a number of conferences, and since Erwin's background was an early colonial and so on, we decided to put together a conference on that. I also worked very closely with the then person who was dean at Fordham University, Father Joseph Fries.
Okay. Tell me about Erwin and how he got involved in the union.
Okay, I think so. This is just
secondhand.
my impression.
Yeah.
Erwin was not particularly interested in the union as such. His wife was.
Okay.
I don't know whether you ever met Sheila Polishuk. She
Unless
was from Queensboro.
Unless she came to the retirement party when Erwin retired, I'm not sure. She might not have been alive.
No, she's
Oh,
alive.
she is, yeah,
She's
okay.
alive.
So I might have met her then.
In poor shape now, physically. Anyway, Sheila became involved in the union and realized that the person who had taken control once the union had come together, when the legislative conference came together with the other group, I really forget their name now, to create the Professional Staff Congress, the person in charge was Belle Zeller from Brooklyn College. Now, Belle was a dynamic, very dynamic individual. But Sheila recognized that there was no one close enough to her, to Belle, to move into a leading position once Belle came to that point where she would retire. and she convinced Irwin to get involved, and that I think was the impetus to get Irwin into the union.
So when he became vice president in, I think it was 72 or 3, that was under Belzeller?
That's right.
And then, because one thing I found in your file was interesting was that this was yet another time when you were called in to take over someone's class at the last minute, right?
That's right. That's right.
So this, because Irwin taught a big U.S. history class?
Yes, he sure did.
Yeah.
Well, in those days, we taught courses that had 120 students.
Mm-hmm.
I had 2 TAs assisting at that time.
And when did that stop?
After, well, the first few years of open enrollment on this campus was really quite something to see. Every corner, every nook was being used as a classroom. And then it was realized that some of these courses just cannot be taught. Even though it's the major institutions across the country have moved into these large lecture halls, we decided that we're going to go back to an earlier form in Hunter College where the largest class would be 35 students. And especially in the humanities, we determined that we were going to drop these major really lecture courses where the students in the back, of course, probably had no idea of what was going on in the front, and who knows what they were doing in the back at the same time.
Right.
So we moved back again into the individual classrooms.
You wrote a report on the status of adjuncts in CUNY in 1971. Can you talk about that and compare that to what's your impression of adjuncts over the following 3 decades?
Well, we had, especially again in the for the evening program, we used a lot of adjuncts, especially once we moved in the direction of open enrollment.
Right.
We had the student body and we needed the faculty. We had, again, just speaking from the history department, we had a very good group of adjuncts. Some of those adjuncts moved on eventually into full-time positions, either in CUNY or in SUNY. A number of them ended up in Albany. So we really had a very solid group. And from the outset, every one of those adjuncts spent more time in the office talking to students than sometimes they spent in the classroom. And that, of course, was far above and beyond what was expected of them. Over the years, that changed to some extent. Not so much in the history department. I must say that the history department continued on a fairly high level as far as the adjuncts were concerned. But knowing what went on the second floor of Carman Hall with adjuncts in other departments, I realized that the history department was far above, far superior in what they were doing, and what the level of the adjuncts were far superior to many other groups that had offices on the second floor.
So you mentioned Carman Hall. When did the history department move into Carman Hall? Was it an original occupant?
We were originally in Schuster.
Right.
In fact, my office was, if I'm not mistaken, was just opposite 336,
Okay.
the conference room.
There's a bathroom there now.
Well, not the bathroom, just a little further in.
Okay.
We moved Carman, I honestly don't remember the year that Carman Hall was opened. No air conditioning. It was especially as we came into the spring semester and even into the early fall semester, very uncomfortable. And 3 of us taught summer school. It was Larry Ratner, Wally Seifer, and myself. The 3 of us basically taught the courses in the summer. Very hot, very uncomfortable. Even as I said, early in the fall, it was very uncomfortable. Now, at that time, in the late 60s, when Carmen was already open, teaching across the hall for me was Ruth Westheimer.
Okay.
And one of the graduate students at the time at what was then already Lehman College was my wife,
Irene.
And she kept on hearing stories about the comments that these two professors were making across the corridors about what was being taught in each of the class, because I kept on hearing everything she was saying at the time, and she heard everything I was saying. We had to keep the doors open
Right.
because it was impossible. You just couldn't survive
Right.
in any other way. So that turned out to be very funny. Then, of course, Ruth, when there was a period of retrenchment, Ruth lost the position.
Here's a general question, and you've already answered some of it. What changes at Lehman have you seen over the years you were here that you see as positive changes?
All right, positive changes. That leaves a little time to think. Insofar as must say that as far as some of the other departments that I'm familiar with, and I was familiar with a lot of departments because I was involved in that group known as RELATE.
Okay.
Liberal arts, the relationship of liberal arts to teacher education.
Okay.
So I knew enough about what's going on in other departments. I felt that to some extent the departments had actually improved in their, not only in their curriculum, but even insofar as the personnel. In one period of time, especially in the early years of early and open enrollment, when the departments had to overnight increase their personnel, some people came into those departments that should never have been in the classroom.
Tell me about the RELATE committee and specifically kind of the history of teacher ed at Lehman. How has that changed over time?
Well, that has drastically changed. Hunter College basically was a teacher education college, and but the emphasis was on preparing people to go into education, basically the elementary schools and the high school. There was, of course, emphasis on science, but it wasn't an overall emphasis on science. That changed, especially up here in the Bronx, when very early the science courses were being pushed. So not only were you supposed to have a solid background in education preparation, but a background in the sciences as well. As a holdover from the Hunter days, the basic education courses, teacher education courses, and I spoke to a lot of students, were really meaningless. In fact, there's a story of why Ruth Westheimer lost her position, because one of the senior people in the department who should have retired 35 years ago held on until the first day of the courses of the following semester, when he announced his retirement. And if he had retired just a month before, Ruth Westheimer would probably have remained at Lehman College until she retired. It's just one of those things. So the education department was way behind the times. On top of that, the students going into education, some of them, not all of them, some of them, were really students who should never have been on the campus. So finally, the education department recognized the fact that they've got to tighten up, and they really changed the curriculum, and they really changed the whole entrance requirements to get into the teacher education programs. That was a very big step forward.
And this was 73, 74?
Yes, absolutely.
And so you've seen did you see a kind of a, how long did it take for that to have an effect?
A number of years, a number of years.
And that's because the faculty took some time to catch up to
The
that?
faculty took time, and you had to go through the students who were
Right.
already in the pipeline.
Right. Have you seen, since you know, I know teaching at Lehman, I often think about a connection between the people we teach to be teachers and the students we get.
Right.
Did you see a change in the quality of students we got coming in as teacher ed improved?
Yes, again, basically, those who are coming in the late afternoon and so on. The morning courses, the early morning courses, having the students in preparing for teacher education, there was not that great an improvement.
Yeah. What was your biggest challenge at Lehman?
Okay, the biggest challenge was actually getting the students to understand that every course that is taught in the college is an English course.
Mm-hmm.
And that every course should involve writing. And to get them to understand that, and to get some of the faculty to understand that in and of itself was a battle over a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it finally has developed to that point, with, of course, the emphasis, the great emphasis now on writing across the curriculum.
Yes, no, I would agree with you. We haven't talked about, we talked a little bit about open enrollment. We haven't talked much about the budget crisis of, well, the various budget crises.
Right, absolutely.
And you lived through 2 or 3 of them.
Yes.
Can you talk about some of those and some of the impact that had on you
sure.
personally and on the college?
Well, first of all, the faculty on what was it, 1975, were furloughed for 2 weeks. We didn't know there was going to be 2 weeks. We thought it was going to be longer than that. And it was determined that we would all show up at the unemployment offices in regalia, which I did. I went to my local unemployment office and so on and applied for unemployment. And they just laughed at us. They said, look, you'll be going back to work. We know that it's eventually going to be resolved. We're not even going to bother, going through the paperwork. But we did this, of course, to make an impact, to make a statement. So it really did have a direct impact on us. It took a long time before we got that money back.
Mm-hmm.
Then, as far as the students went, of course, that was the institution of tuition.
Right.
When Irene, my wife, first of all, was an undergraduate at Hunter, and where the largest payment she ever made was a $12 fee for breakage because she was taking a lab course.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, everything was given to the students gratis, including their textbooks.
Mm-hmm.
Even up here, we had a big bookstore. The bookstore was not selling books. The bookstore was distributing books. And the students would come into the bookstore with the list of the required books, and they would be given the books. Well, you can imagine how long you would be using the same kind of textbook in any of these courses. So even from the outset, we decided we've got to bring in some other material.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some really very, very basic changes that occurred. Now, on top of that, of course, there was retrenchment.
Yes.
So there were a number of times. It wasn't just one occasion. There were a number of occasions where we actually had to go through the process of retrenchment. On one occasion, I was accused, really more than accused, of protecting the history department, while other departments really had to be downgraded or actually eliminated. One of the departments was, what do they call it? In those days, they called it home economics, which we eliminated. And there was a long, long battle with a particular individual in the home economics department over that issue.
I think I know who
And
you're talking
unfortunately, Leonard Leaf put me in charge of the college's position as to why that should be removed and how the whole situation should be handled. So that was a delicate time.
about. Tell me about your dealings with Leonard Leaf over the years.
Well, it was here at the college as well as after the college. We had a working relationship, nothing too close. When I have really still not know who recommended that I, act as a dean, but once as in the dean's office, what I did quite frequently, and every day in fact, was I came in quite early and made coffee. And Leonard soon realized that if he wanted a fresh cup of coffee, that was the place to go. So every morning I had Leonard Leaf in the office, sitting there and drinking coffee and chatting about everything. Unfortunately, I'm really not a baseball fan. So I really didn't know that much about the baseball situation, which he was.
This was 1987 or so, we figured out, right?
Yeah.
Was he a Yankees fan or a Mets fan?
He was a Mets fan.
Okay.
And yeah, he went to a number of Yankee games. I remember him once saying that he actually, one of these games that lasted on and on and on, and he had finally realized he had better get home, and he had to fight his way out of the parking lot. So I remember that story. But anyway, that was our relationship. Once he retired, he moved into the position of the university, gave him a position as being the director of publications.
Okay.
Well, there were no publications, but he had an office, West 42nd Street, way over on the west side. And since we had, established a fairly close relationship by that time, he invited me down for lunch a couple of times. So we sat there and we chatted, and he complained about, of course, that he was doing nothing, just twiddling his thumbs while he was sitting in this office. Although he did have that program on television where he interviewed,
Okay.
which he loved.
Was that on CUNY TV? Or?
That was CUNY TV.
Right.
He really loved that.
Who did he interview? I mean, what kind of show was it?
He interviewed it's actually writers.
Because he was an English professor originally.
Writers, as well as people in the arts. So that he thoroughly enjoyed. Then that was given up. Of course, eventually the university dropped that. A couple of years later, his wife was in very, very serious physical condition, and he was having problems as well. And they decided to sell their home in Yonkers and to move to a facility where they would have support, health, medical support. And they moved to a place that was within, I'd say, 3 to 4 miles away from my home.
Okay.
And again, I don't know who told him or tipped him off that I was very close by. So he called and said, would you come over? Which I did. Well, that started a very, very close relationship, and that continued until his death.
Tell me about, you've been commuting from Ossining to the Bronx since the mid-'60s.
That's right.
Has that commute changed?
Well, I'll tell you, this is my experience in the last 2 weeks. Coming down last week for commencement, I had road problems from the time I left the house. This is starting up in Westchester. So today I actually gave myself more time, and sure enough, There was absolutely nothing on the road, and it came down here in probably about 32, 33 minutes from door to door.
Did you ever miss a class because of traffic?
Not because of traffic. No, I always was able to get here in time for traffic. I was always here much earlier than the course. However, as far as missing a particular meeting of a class, yes, that did happen, but not because of the traffic. And when I began here, we had very heavy programs. We all taught 5 sections, 5 courses a semester. And I had to keep a chart as to what course met on a particular day and what we were involved in, what we were up to in the course at that particular day. And this one evening, I was sitting in my office and looked at my watch and said, oh, my courses are over today. I'm going to go home. And I got into the car, and I was practically within a few miles away from the house when I realized I had another course. So I had Larry Ratner was the chair at that time, and I called Larry and told him, he went hysterical. He thought it was so funny.
Yeah.
But what annoyed me is that I had been sitting in my office between the courses. Students had seen me sitting in the office. Not one came in to ask whether I was coming in. So I chastised them the
Well,
next
it's not
meeting.
like they probably assumed you knew when you were teaching.
That was funny.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to add?
I'm just trying to think of what general topics.
I mean, why don't you tell me a little more about the bookstore? Because I hadn't realized what you did mention. You were on a bookstore committee at one point.
Oh, yes.
How long has the bookstore in the so-called temporary building been there, and when was that built?
Well, the original bookstore was down in the catacombs.
Okay.
In between the buildings, in the lower,
In the tunnels.
the tunnel, and that originally was where they distributed the books.
Right.
When that left, and it became an outside individual, they took that particular area because already at least they had the shelving. Once that was changed and modified, then once they started to put this temporary building up, which is still here,
Right.
then they moved the bookstore. What year, I honestly can't remember.
And
I remember one particular story relating to the bookstore, that the manager, the original manager, his name was Wysotsky. Now, if you taught New York history, or if you taught American Jewish history, you knew that Wysotsky was the name of a tea company that was based in New York City that specialized in making sure that the tea that they served was kosher. So I happened to ask him, I said, do you have any connection to that family with the tea company? He said, how do you know? And that was very funny. And he left eventually because they changed managers. They actually changed the company
Right.
that was selling the books.
Right. Let me just look at my notes. I've got a few other things. You were on, at one point, I mean, this is digging way back, you were on the registrar search committee at one point, and can you kind of generally tell me about, I know from kind of anecdote that the way students registered for classes used to be very, very different.
Oh, and how. This was all really face-to-face. We would have to, I'll use the term loosely, man the desks. And we would have to have people available, whether it was the daytime program or the evening program, because students could register at any time, to speak directly and to put the students in singly, individually, into the specific courses. That took a tremendous amount of time. The students objected strenuously because quite frequently they had to wait for hours before they could even get into the room where they were going to register.
And how long did that last? When did they start moving over to computers?
Years.
Yeah.
A number of years. That continued, I'd say, well into the 1990s.
Lehman's went from probably like 16, 17,000 students during open enrollment.
That's right.
Back down to under 10,000, and now
right.
it's back on the rise again.
That's right.
As it was, as numbers were declining,
Yeah.
what in the, I guess in the 80s, what was the kind of vibe on the campus in terms of you know, what was what your mission was, what what you were going to do to reverse that?
Well, we had a number of student uprisings here in those days. Basically, they were concerned either with the amount of courses that they had to take, that was one problem, or the kind of general curriculum. For example, I remember being locked in when they had the big discussion that there really should be a Black Studies
Right.
and a Puerto Rican Studies programs
Right.
instituted. Well, a group of us felt that there should be, rather than separating the two entities, that there should, if we want to create anything, come up with a different name. But we were thinking in terms of ethnic studies, an overall program, rather than to separate it. Well, that went on and on and on. And eventually, one individual from the history department rose up. It happened to be Corinne Weston, may she rest in peace. And Corinne made the suggestion, let's resolve this, let's create two separate departments, which eventually we did. I still reserve the right to say I did not agree with it then, and I still don't agree with it.
Any other, in terms of curriculum and I know you also kind of lived through changes in the gen ed curriculum at
That's right.
Lehman.
That's
Tell me
right.
something about that.
Well, that again was through the determination, if we were going to think in terms of teacher education, what type of backgrounds, what kinds of courses would be necessary for someone to move into the classroom. I remember teaching back in the Hunter days, where I would have students and I would be able to tell the students the area that they had been specializing in their earlier courses, whether it was to teach second grade or to teach fifth grade. And I said, that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. You've got to have a general background where you can be moved into any area as far as how you handle children on the second or the fifth grade. That is that's a separate area.
Right.
But as far as the content of what you have in your own head has to be very, very broad. And that's what we decided, what we tried to change.
And have you noticed, as Lehman has, I mean, they still obviously a lot of students go on to be teachers, but it's probably a minority now.
Yes.
How did you notice in terms of teaching introductory courses and so forth, what changed as students went into going into business and health areas in terms of what they brought to the classroom?
Well, as far as the health areas, I've had some very, very good students coming from the health areas. I've had some top nurses taking some courses because either they had an RN from and a community college background and now wanted a BS, and they needed additional coursework, and they were good students. As far as the general students moving into, let's say, business education and so on, quite frequently they'd ask, you know, what relationship does this course have with what I'm going to be doing? And I kept on pointing out to them that the majority of CEOs in the country had majored in history.
You mentioned community colleges. You know, now, as you know, more than half of our incoming students spent some time at BCC or Hostos.
Yes.
Has that always been the case? Has there been a connection between those two colleges?
Yes, from the outset. And I must say that, quite truthfully, it has been not the most pleasant. I think a number of the students coming in from some of the community colleges just were not prepared.
Have you been back to BCC since being there as an undergraduate on that campus?
I went once or twice. Actually, I was very, very close friends with the chairman of the history department at BCC, Sam Ehrenpreis, who also has passed on. So I went back a number of times when Sam was still there.
So what was your impression of the campus in the 70s versus when you were an undergraduate in the 50s?
Well, they had added buildings, which did not exist when I was there. And the Hall of Fame was not in the best condition.
How about adding buildings to Lehman? Because since you showed up in '63, there's
Absolutely
a lot of changes on the campus.
That's right. That's right. The well, first of all, the Carmen Hall, Schuster Hall also, the Apex, Performing Arts Center, the library, and really I have to give Leonard Leaf great credit for all of those activities.
So what was the campus like before those buildings? Was there a lot more trees, or what filled that space?
We had a very large open area in the center, and just empty, along with some trees, some shrubs. We had, there was a little garden which only exists in a very limited area now, on the approach to the Apex. That's been cut down. As far as in the general area, we had an large, just green area with a lawn. And there we had the famous Necker Checker. I don't know if anyone
I've not heard of that one.
You never heard of that? Okay. In those days, if a male and female students sat on the campus together, they had to be separated. They could not be touching.
This is the early 60s.
In any way. Under the Dean of Students' office, there was, we referred to her as a Necker Checker. This woman would go around with a stick, and if the couple happened to be very closely associated, she would tap them with the stick and then point out how far apart they would have to sit. So we all thought that was just a joke. I mean, that was just absolutely lunacy from day one. But that continued for a number of years until finally it was dropped.
So Hunter in the Bronx was co-ed by the time you showed up in
Yes,
'63,
yes,
but
yes.
only recently.
Well, Hunter was co-ed even when I showed up because they had opened the Bronx campus to the veterans.
Okay.
And then gradually Hunter downtown became co-ed. Actually, they began talking about making Hunter co-ed by '64.
Okay. Was it still majority women?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So when did that start to change? I guess it never changed.
It never changed.
Yeah.
It never changed.
Yeah.
But up here, of course, it changed quite quickly.
And okay, I'm out of questions. Do you have any other things you'd like to add?
No, I'm just trying to think of what we may not have touched on. I think we pretty much covered the gamut.
Good. I think we're done then. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
was my pleasure.
Great.